Hello, and welcome to today's Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly terrifying, completely unexpected mid-air incident that recently unfolded on an Air India flight making its way from Phuket to Delhi. I mean, imagine you're on a plane, right? You're settling in after a great vacation, totally trusting the incredible machinery and the highly skilled pilots up front to get you home safely. Everything feels perfectly routine, until, suddenly, it just isn't. We're going to break down exactly what happened in the skies over Delhi, why the flight crew was completely blindsided, and what this actually means for the modern aviation tech that we all rely on every day.
But before we get into the tech, to really understand the gravity of this incident, we have to ground the story in the human stakes. 134. That is the number of lives, passengers and crew members combined, who were on board this aircraft when the nightmare started. These aren't just statistics on a flight manifest. These are families, tourists, business folks who are just expecting a normal, everyday landing. Whenever we talk about aviation and extreme weather phenomena, it's absolutely crucial to remember that inside that metal tube, soaring thousands of feet up in the air, there are 134 beating hearts that are totally at the mercy of the elements.
All right, let's get into it. A sudden mid-air nightmare. Calm skies to chaos in seconds. Picture the scene inside the cabin. People are probably reading a book, maybe dozing off, or just chatting quietly. There is absolutely no indication whatsoever that anything is wrong. And then, completely without warning, a massive, unexpected jolt violently rocks the aircraft. The original reporting actually describes it as a huge shock. I mean, try to imagine that visceral physical experience of being thrown by that kind of intense force when you're sitting in what feels like a perfectly safe, stable environment. And the scariest part? The passengers didn't even have a chance to brace themselves because the seatbelt signs weren't on for turbulence. It was just this instant, terrifying disruption of a totally peaceful flight. So let's talk about the invisible threat and why the pilots couldn't see it coming. In an era where our planes are decked out with these state-of-the-art radar and weather tracking systems, you might be wondering, how did this threat remain invisible? Why couldn't highly trained pilots just see it coming? Well, this wasn't a massive thunderstorm. There were no dark, ominous clouds for the pilots to navigate around. Actually, this was a phenomenon known as clear air turbulence, or CAT. It's this violent turbulence that happens in completely cloudless regions of the sky. And get this, instances of severe CAT have actually jumped by over 50% in the last 4 decades, which is largely linked to climate change messing with our jet streams. Because there's no moisture or weather system there to reflect radar waves, it is literally invisible. The pilots couldn't see it looking out the window, and it bounces zero signal back to their multi-million-dollar weather radars. If we strip away all the complex meteorology for a second, you're essentially looking at severe wind shear. These high-speed air currents are clashing high up in the atmosphere, and they create a powerful, chaotic vortex. If a plane happens to cross its path, it's exactly like hitting a massive, invisible pothole at hundreds of miles per hour. This high-speed gust completely blindsided the aircraft, rendering all its advanced early warning systems totally useless in that specific moment. Moving on to the impact, injuries, and damage, let's take a look at the physical toll inside the cabin. There's a detail from the reporting that really stuck with me. It notes that if you look at the video footage taken right after the incident, cracks are clearly visible in the interior of the plane. Let that sink in for a second. Just think about the sheer level of structural stress and physical force required to actually crack the interior ceiling of a massive commercial airliner. That detail alone tells you pretty much everything you need to know about how violently this aircraft was shaken. We aren't talking about a bumpy ride here. This was a severe physical impact on the frame of the plane itself. Now, thankfully, the physical injuries sustained by the passengers and crew members were officially classified as minor. But look, minors still meant a completely terrifying and painful ordeal for the people involved. We know this for sure because emergency hospital transports were immediately required the second they touched down in Delhi. And like we just talked about, the sheer violence of that turbulence left very real, visible structural damage on the cabin interior. This whole event left a serious mark, not just on the people, but on the plane itself. Which brings us to what makes this a very close call, the crucial factor of timing. When you look at the timeline of this flight, it really builds a clear picture of just how lucky these 134 people were. The sudden clear air turbulence hit just prior to their descent. That means the aircraft was still high enough to absorb the shock, giving the pilots enough altitude and time to maintain control before they started their final approach. But just imagine, for a second, what would have happened if this massive, violent jolt had hit them just a few minutes later? I mean, during the actual landing sequence, the plane is much closer to the ground, it's flying a lot slower, and the margin for error is significantly smaller. As the reporting points out, if this had struck during landing, we could have been looking at a massive disaster. It was a remarkably narrow escape, dictated entirely by the clock. The absolute biggest sigh of relief here is that the plane touched down safely and everyone survived. No lives were lost. But while we can of course celebrate that for the passengers and crew, an incident like this means the story doesn't just end on the tarmac. When a commercial aircraft takes this much damage from a completely invisible force, some really serious questions remain about accountability and overall safety moving forward.
And that is exactly why the DGCA investigation begins, seeking answers for aviation safety.
So, what are the investigators actually looking for? Well, the DGCA's investigation basically hinges on three key pillars. First up is a thorough inspection of the aircraft's structural integrity, because honestly, a cracked ceiling means the core frame of that plane needs a major checkup before it can ever think about flying again. Next, they're going to review any potential systemic or technical flaws. They need to know if any subtle atmospheric data was somehow missed by the instruments, or if the plane's automated systems responded the way they were supposed to. And finally, and this is critical, they have to reevaluate overall passenger safety protocols. Are there better ways we can protect people from a threat that gives literally zero warning? The DGCA is going to be looking very closely at all of this.
And that brings us to our final thought for today's explainer. As the reporting pointed out, despite all our incredibly modern technology, our advancements, and our rigorous safety protocols, wild incidents like this still happen. If instances of invisible clear air turbulence are continuing to rise thanks to changing global weather patterns, we have to ask, just how vulnerable is our modern aviation technology? It's a pretty sobering reminder that as much as we feel like we've conquered the skies, we are still fundamentally at the mercy of the invisible forces of nature. Thank you so much for joining me to unpack this incredible story. Keep looking up, but hey, maybe always keep that seatbelt fastened. See you next time.